Hi, back in September 2024, I published a video about the Italian military, which was very successful to my pleasure. What I did is I talked about how the Italian military was sort of like the overlooked giant of Europe. We don't think about the Italian military as being particularly large or powerful. We always think about maybe the French or the Germans or the British, but in reality, the Italian military is huge. And in the video, I compared it favorably, in fact, to Great Britain's military and argued that Italy seemed to be able to get a whole lot more for its money than the British did. In many ways, the UK, the Italian military was as large as, perhaps even larger in some ways, than the UK's military. And of course, UK has nuclear weapons, nuclear submarines, that kind of thing, which is super expensive and does explain part of the disparity in terms of the budgets. But either way, when you look at the dysfunctions of the British military and all the problems they've had with modernization, et cetera, the Italians do very well. I put a link somewhere up in the description to the Italy video, so you can check that out. I think it's very interesting. There's also a reminder, I also need to do an update on the British, because the British are, lots of stuff is happening with respect to the British military. None of it particularly good, but I'll leave that conversation for another video. Now, since then, September 2024, the world really hasn't become a more gentle place. It's become, frankly, less forgiving, more hostile. And Italy, like everybody else, is quietly updating its plans and capabilities. So in this video, what I'm doing is I'm going to update that earlier analysis, and I'm going to look at what has changed in terms of spending, personnel, doctrine, and hardware. Italian thinkings about what kind of war do they need to be able to fight? What do they need to be ready for? And what are they actually doing in order to prepare for that future war that they're now increasingly thinking about? I like to be transparent about my sources. So in this case, the key reference that I'm going to use, that I'm going to cite, is a document that came out in, I think, October 2025, called the, forgive my Italian pronunciation, the Documento Programmatico Pluriannale della Difesa, the Defense Multi-Year Planning Document 2025 to 2027. This is just another iteration of a regular periodic thing that the Italian government issues. It's a periodic forward-looking document that lays out Italy's defense priorities and budgets and missions and what do they think that they're up to. This, because it was published in 2025, October 2025, to my knowledge, nothing else has really changed. So it is as valid of a reference point as any I can come up with. So that's what we're going to work with. I'm going to divide the video into several parts with timestamps in the description in case you want to jump around. Part 1 uses Italy's own language. I'm going to use Italy's own language from the DPP, as it's called, that defense planning document, to set the strategic context. Part 2, I want to look at spending, personnel, and of course the missions that the DPP assigns the armed forces. This is super important. You don't know what you need to spend money on if you don't know what your military is actually for. To the extent to which the DPP states what the Italian military is for, I'm going to discuss that and point out what it's saying. Part 3, I'm going to look at the Italian army, what they're doing, the changes that they're trying to do in order as they make their adjustments given the changes in the strategic context. Part 4, I want to focus on the Navy and their concept of the wider Mediterranean. Part 5 is going to cover the Air Force. I'm going to talk about F-35s and Eurofighters and the GCAP, the GCAP, Sixth Generation Future Fighter Program, air defenses, etc. Part 6, I'm going to try to put it all together and go back to the basic questions. Having adopted the DPP in October 2025, and with these modernization plans that we've talked about, is the Italian military heading in the right direction? As usual, if you like this content, please hit like and subscribe. Also, if you feel so inclined, you can toss some money my way using the thanks button, or you can buy me a coffee using a link in the description below. You can also become a member of the channel, which would make you among the coolest people on earth. And don't forget to check out the merch, because you got to have merch if you're going to be on YouTube. So let's get started. Okay, part 1, strategic context in Italy's own words, per the DP. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show like the bits and pieces that are in the Italian. I'm going to sort of translate and explain what actually is the point. So what does the 2025 DPP say? First of all, it says, here's the Italian. I'm not going to pronounce this because I'm going to butcher it and embarrass myself. But basically, the geopolitical presently is unstable and it's a mess and it's in this critical situation. The world's going to hell. That's sort of a nice way of saying it. And also, it talks about Ukraine. It says the invasion of Ukraine has created a breaking point and accelerated international dynamics that are already underway and produced a deep polarization at the global level. For Italy, Ukraine is the hinge into a harsher era of strategic competition. And that's what the Italians need to have in mind when they're thinking about where their military is going. Then we've got this idea of the Mediterraneo allargato, which is the wider Mediterranean that they see as having it. There are significant shocks to the entire wider Mediterranean area, which is they define in terms of an area of fundamental strategic interest for Italy. And the wider Mediterranean, according to them, stretches from beyond the Mediterranean Sea itself, from the Atlantic all the way through North Africa, the Middle East, and even the Black Sea. One of the things I like about the focus on the wider Mediterranean, and this is something that I think is to Italy's advantage in terms of how they spend their defense dollars, particularly when you compare it to the British or the French, is that the British and the French have always had this problem where they still have these sort of global ambitions and have these ideas about being able to be involved militarily at a global level, thanks to their own histories and their own imperial histories. Italy, not really. Italy's more focused on the Mediterranean. And I think that the narrower focus makes it easier for them to think about what to spend money on and what not. And I think that translates into efficiencies. You can spend money more efficiently if you have more clarity about what you actually need. The more you try to be able to do everything and the less clarity you have, the more you're going to end up sort of messing around, fussing around and buying stuff you don't need or being indecisive or indecision. And of course, the British are the best examples of what happens if you're indecisive and how that translates into really bad weapons procurement programs. So the Italians see themselves as being at the center of the arc of crisis, which starts with NATO's eastern frontier, Ukraine, Russia, and extends south through the Mediterranean, Middle East, Mediterranean, and even to the Sahel. And it really sees itself as being at the hinge between the eastern and southern flanks. So this is where their eyes on. They're on this hinge between these two flanks of the alliance. Now, with regard to these crises, the DPP insists that Italy is strongly engaged, both operationally and cooperatively within NATO, the European Union, the UN, and bilateral frameworks while maintaining a global approach, whatever that means. They also talk about how interstate warfare is back on the table. It's back at the center of discussion. So it says, Ukraine war, it notes, has brought public debate on the use of the military instrument in conflict between states back to center stage. So Italy is openly now talking about interstate high-intensity war and not simply stabilization or peacekeeping. Next, there's this idea that Italy needs to rethink energy supply chains and must become much more resilient and think about the growing importance of critical infrastructure, logistics, energy, communications, all this for national resilience. And as part of that, the idea that the DPP argues that if you want to build a modern defense, you can't separate this from thinking about technological transformation. Emerging technologies are no longer optional. It's debatable, but that's what the DPP says. They are effective multipliers. But it warns that behind each technology also lies a raw material, and behind each raw material, there's a geopolitical tension. Everybody who's dependent on critical materials puts them all at strategic risk, which is something that they need to think about. Lastly, there is a sort of almost token language about the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic. It says that the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic are now crucial arenas in global competition. Italy wants to reinforce commercial, industrial, and defense ties in the Indo-Pacific and watch new Arctic sea routes and resource competition closely. So its strategic horizon runs from the wider Mediterranean out to the Indo-Pacific and up into the Arctic. I'm skeptical about this, and frankly, I think that the Italians shouldn't bother with this. Like I would rather see the Italians not talk about the Indo-Pacific and not talk about the Arctic, because their traditional focus on the Mediterranean is an advantage, right? Because it just narrows quite a bit the scope of the capabilities that they need to have, where if you start talking about Indo-Pacific or the Arctic, this widens the scope, and I think that's bad, and I think in Italy's case, that's absolutely unnecessary. Part two, let's talk about missions, but also money and manpower. So what does the DPP say that the Italian money is for? It identifies certain key missions. Let's go through these. First of all, there's deterrence. This is interesting. Thinking about conventional deterrence. They want to make sure that nobody attacks Italy or attacks the alliance because they're going to be afraid to, and Italy wants to contribute to this. So Italy says that the first mission is classic deterrence, ensuring an adequate level of deterrence to protect Italy's vital and strategic interests and its alliance commitments. Next comes rapid projection. So while I said that Italy doesn't necessarily have a global projection ambition, they still are all about being able to project power, amphibious power, air power, sea power. So they say that they want to be able to demonstrate the ability to project power, to project forces rapidly and precisely. so they can intervene promptly in crisis scenarios. This, of course, aligns with the fact that they have 2 aircraft carriers, and then the Italian Navy also has robust amphibious capabilities. And third, they wish to be able to sustain prolonged operations in high-intensity conflicts. Italy is officially planning for serious interstate warfare and not just for brief deployments. This is super important here. This is a shift also that we're seeing everywhere else. We also see it with the French, and we see it recently in the videos I made about Canada. If you want to be able to field a large unit in heavy combat, let's say a brigade, an armored brigade, which is, I believe, something the Italians aspire to be able to do, you can't just take the order of battle of this brigade and say, well, that's enough. You also need to have all sorts of organic support systems and logistical capabilities. You also need depth. You need extra munitions. You need extra stuff so that you can deal with attrition. You need much more than simply a paper brigade. The Canadians are doing the same thing because the Canadians realize that they really can't form a brigade and sustain the brigade, which is why the Canadians realize that they need a division. The French have done something similar with their going to a divisional structure, but also trying to grow it, realizing that being able to deploy a brigade in conventional warfare takes a whole lot more than deploying a brigade, let's say, to Mali in Operation Serval in 2013, in terms of the amount of support. Now, in terms of spending and personnel, this is very interesting. The Italians are moving slowly to spend more, and I believe they have recently, not sure if I think they reached the 2% limit, and they've gone from thus in the last few years from 1.5% of GDP to now about 2%. Part of this, admittedly, though, has been helped by accounting tricks. So they are simply including more things in the defense budget than they might have done previously. And it's all perfectly legitimate from the point of view of NATO accounting rules. So in particular, what they've done is, from what I've read, that they've included internal security expenses like the Carabinieri, but also pension spending as part of the defense budget. So that inflates the defense budget, enables the Italians to say, look at us, we can hit 2% and we're growing. Now, there have been real increases in terms of the operational stuff and the meaningful things, in addition to the accounting tricks. But the growth of the money, when they talk about like increase the budget, and now they're at 2%, it's not quite accurate. So the real gains are not as much as advertised. The projected average strength of the 3 armed services is about 167,000 people. That includes 98,000 roughly in the Army, 30,000 people in the Navy, and about 40,000 people in the Air Force. They also throw in the Carabinieri, which that weighs in at about 112,000 people. But anyways, you end up with roughly 160,000 people in the armed forces, not including the Carabinieri. This is noteworthy in part because they had recently had a law saying that they needed to reduce the size of the military, mainly I think to the idea of because of the expense and the pensions and all that kind of stuff. But basically they've cut it a little bit, but not nearly as much as they were supposed to, and it looks like it's stopped. The Italians are stopping. They're not going to cut their force any more than they already have. So they did not go as far as it originally intended. So while Italy is not building a huge army like the Poles are, or frankly like the Germans are or hope to, it has decided that they can't hollow the army out anymore and have the kinds of pretensions for high intensity warfare that they do. So, and then everything else that follows in terms of their spending, what they're now spending their money on, is all about that. It's about modestly raising the budgets, increasing the budgets in order to stabilize the size of the force and then to build out the missions and the capabilities aligned with the missions of deterrence and rapid force projection, and also to be able to sustain fighting abroad. So it's not a revolutionary change at all. It's not like the Germans who are talking about radical change. It's much more incremental and gradual, but it's real. Part 3, now let's focus on the army. The Italian army is not envisioning any major reorganization or any major changes to the force structure, which makes them different from the French, who went back to divisional structure, or the Canadians, who are going back to divisional structure. And they're reordering themselves in order to be able to sustain a larger scale conventional fight. Italians aren't doing that. But arguably what the Italian army is doing is it's trying to buff up its heavy conventional combat capabilities. So for instance, one of the things that they're doing is they're trying to improve and modernize and replace their medium and heavy armored vehicles. They're modernizing them in order to keep them alive before they can replace them with new stuff. In concrete terms, this means the following. First of all, this affects several families of vehicles. At the middle, you've got the Centauro line, the Centauro and the Centauro 2. These are central to the Italian concept of how they want their medium deployable forces to operate. The idea being that these are relatively light. There's sort of a sweet spot between heavy and light because of the wheels versus tracks, but they've got really big guns. And this is about being able to give brigades mobile direct firepower that can move quickly along the road networks and basically operate in the wider Mediterranean. They also are taking the Ariete main battle tank and they're trying to give them a midlife upgrade program to keep them relevant and keep them useful until the next generation of heavy tanks comes in. I'll say a little bit more about those. The Ariete, from what I understand, is a perfectly decent tank. The only real problem with the Ariete tank, I mean, nobody talks about the Ariete. Talk about the Leopards versus the Abrams, and maybe people talk about the Leclerc. From what I understand, the Ariete is a fine tank, but it hasn't been updated. And because of things like the operational requirements of fielding the Italian military in Afghanistan, so that's led to budget cuts. So they just haven't maintained these things particularly well. And there's a shortage of parts. So the fleet of Arietas that they have isn't necessarily very usable. So they're trying to keep them alive. They're trying to address some of that in order to modernize them and keep them in service until they could finally replace them. So in terms of what they're trying to replace them with, they are trying to do a full generational shift. So first, they want to replace the Ariete with this dual thing they're doing. Leonardo, I believe, is doing, or Zypco, I don't know. They're doing it with Rheinmetall. So it's a joint Italian-German thing. It's called the KF-51 Panther, and so that will be their new tank. And then they're also bringing on board the KF-41 Lynx infantry fighting vehicles. They want to buy up to 380 Panther main battle tanks and up to 1,000 Lynx infantry fighting vehicles. It's a long-term program that's going to run into the 2030s. The difference between like the Ariete and this new Panther tank, which is similar to the difference between, I mean, the Ariete is a lot like the Abrams and the Challenger and the Leclerc, which is basically, it's a late Cold War era tank upon which they have since bolted new tech to update it. So it's far better than what it used to be during the Cold War, but fundamentally it's a Cold War era thing. Now, the difference between that and then the Panther is that the Panther is, for one thing, it's got a bigger gun. The Ariete has a 120 millimeter gun. The Panther is going to have a 130 millimeter smoothbore gun. Interesting. But it's going to have modular armor. It's going to have active protection systems. So it's got more firepower. It's better survivability. But I think most importantly, is that the Panther compared to the Ariete is really built around the tech. The tech is organic to the design as opposed to the tech being bolted on. It reminds me of, like the Leclerc I mentioned, it's an old tank upon which the tech's been bolted. The newer French vehicles like the VBCI, the Jaguar, or the Griffin are designed around the technology. So theoretically that makes it better than the older stuff that's just been modernized. Is that true? I don't know, but that's the theory. At any rate, the Panther is the tank that the Italians want to be taking with them into the 2030s and the 2040s. The DPP stresses a rapid and continuous adaptation cycle whose pace and quality depend on how accurately and relevant military information is detected and made available. So, like everybody else, they're all about the information systems. They're all about being able to speed up the OODA loop so that they detect the information, they're able to assess the information, they're able to decide, and then they're able to act. And everything's going to be networked. And this supposedly is going to benefit fire support. It's going to benefit the logistics chain, the procurement chain, and everything's just going to sped up. They want everybody to have a up-to-date, common operating picture so that they can track dynamically the tactical objectives and track what's going on, and they could feed national intelligence into all this, all using the tech and all using the networks. This is the aspiration. Like everybody else, after Ukraine, the Italians are interested in long-range standoff fires and long-range precision fighters. It's really noteworthy. All the Cold War European militaries had large long-range artillery capabilities, rockets and artillery. They had lots of howitzers, self-propelled howitzers, various kinds of long-range rocketry. This was normal. After the Cold War, they disinvested a lot from this, So, it got to the point where like the French had 77 Caesar howitzers, which is not a lot. In the Cold War, they might have had hundreds. Now they've got like 100, right? So it's different. And there's a different mindset that comes when you're thinking about long-range fires for conventional warfare versus the sorts of things that European armies had frankly been doing for the last 20 years. And a great example of this is that when the French were doing Operation Serval in 2013, the commander of Serval, who was from a mechanized infantry background and thus was more accustomed to thinking about fires, he wanted Caesar howitzers to use in Mali. And his superiors, who were really thinking in terms of light expeditionary warfare, were like, what do you need howitzers for? Mali? Like, you need this stuff. He's like, no, I really do. If anything else, better safe than sorry, but give me howitzers. They gave him 4. So This is consistent with European militaries, and I just bring it up as just an example. You have a small pool of long-range fire capabilities that you're going to dole out in very small increments. Thus, the French sent 4 howitzers to Mali. Just 4. Part of the problem is if you only have 77, 4 is already a fairly large percentage of the 77. But you need more than 77, right? You need hundreds of howitzers. This is what Ukraine has proved. You need a lot of artillery tubes, and you need a lot of rocket artillery, and you need the range of the fires. The greater the distance, the more accurate over large distances, the better. So everybody, including the Italians, are really interested in doing this. So they are working on trying to beef up their missile artillery and the long-range artillery. They're not doing it as aggressively as the Poles are, for example, but they're absolutely doing this. And this is part of the trend. This is the trend across Europe that the Italians are absolutely jumping onto. With respect to air defenses, like everybody else in NATO, Italy disinvested from air defense capabilities because you really didn't need it. They're trying to fix that. So what the Italians are doing is they're trying to build a layered system of ground-based air defense capabilities. For medium-range air defense, they've got this new generation of SAMPT batteries for short range. They've got mobile systems using missiles like the KAMMER, whatever that is, to protect deployed forces and key sites. And at very short range, they've got gun-based air defenses that they're bringing in, something called CRAM, in order to deal with drones and incoming rockets. So they are investing in all this stuff. You've got new armor, renewed heavy medium armor. You've got new long-range fires. And ultimately, the Army slowly but surely is moving away from like a crisis management paradigm to thinking about having a force that can survive a high-intensity land fight with a peer enemy. The Italians have not yet reached the scope of many European countries, but they're still moving in that direction. Before I continue, if you'll indulge me for just a sec for a shameless plug, I published recently this little book called The French Way of War. This is also in French called Penser la guerre à la française. It's what is this little book? 8 strategy lessons for today's conflicts. This book is a distillation of many years worth of study and writing about contemporary French military strategy. What I mean by that is more like 20th and 21st century French military strategy. I've read thousands and thousands of pages of this stuff. I've read thousands of pages of French military doctrine. It's got some really awesome things in it, and I've distilled it down. So yes, this is a very short book, but this is the small bottle of Johnny Walker Blue versus like a big jug of Johnny Walker Black or Jack Daniels or something like that. It's a terrible analogy. It is available on Amazon internationally in both French and in English. So Amazon.com, Amazon Italy, Amazon UK, Amazon Canada, Amazon France, of course, etc. Thank you. Let's go back to talking about Italy. Part 5, the Navy and the wider Mediterranean. The DPP affirms this idea of the wider Mediterranean, and so the Navy is really central to this. And as a result, the Navy is thinking about refreshing its fleet. They're bringing in new modern patrol ships, multi-purpose patrol ships, plus more of the modern frigates. Like a lot of them, the FREM, the sort of Franco-Italian thing that they're doing, that the USS Constellation was supposed to be, but we managed to screw that up. And they're also investing in a new generation of submarines, and they're trying to sustain their amphibious capabilities. These ships also are intended to have stronger air defense capabilities, and in the past have better sensors. To have new long-range strike capabilities is something the Italians had not emphasized nearly as much, like land attack cruise missiles. Now they're doing that. And then you've got the carrier aviation. This is really important. Italy has not 1 but 2 aircraft carriers. You've got the Cavour and the Trieste. Arguably, these are LHDs. These are amphibious assault carriers. The U.S. Marine Corps operates a whole bunch of these. They have serious fighting power because they have Harriers and F-35Bs. The F-35s are already operating, from what I understand, off of the Cavour, and they are working on getting the new Trieste up to handling the F-35Bs. Although apparently the Trieste was designed for the F-35, but they still haven't quite finished the work yet. They still are operating Harriers, but they're phasing them out, and the plan is that as the F-35Bs come online, they will be replacing the Harriers. This gives Italy, really will give them a unique 2-carrier capability, a 2-carrier F-35B force. It's certainly unique in the EU. It compares, interestingly, with the British, with the Royal Navy, because, of course, the Royal Navy now has these 2 spiffy new carriers, Queen Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales. They're gigantic. They also have F-35Bs, but it's a question about whether or not the British can actually field both carriers at once, given the amount of crew that they have, the amount of F-35s that they have, the amount of escort ships available. And I think it's something that the Italians can do, I believe, more easily, more readily, more flexibility, just because these things are smaller. When I look at these Italian carriers, I can't help but wonder, why didn't the British just build these? Maybe this is what the British need. They need a bunch of Cavour, Trieste. They don't need these mammoth, the Queen Elizabeth, because they're both really big and also not big enough. What do I mean by that? They're really big, they're really expensive, but yet they don't have nuclear propulsion and they don't have catapults. The Italian stuff, it doesn't have those things either, but they're smaller and cheaper. So which is more useful? With the British, I almost feel like they were penny wise and pound foolish. They should have spent the extra money to get proper nuclear-powered catapult bearing carriers like the French do, and that ultimately would be more useful. It's also worth noting that while the overall UK F-35B fleet is on track to be larger than the Italian fleet of F-35Bs, the Italians, though, will have more F-35s altogether, because the Italians are also buying the F-35 for the Air Force, whereas the British are only buying the F-35B, which I believe that the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy are going to share. Why? I mean, that's one of those decisions that the British made that makes me just shake my head. Like, really? You're not going to buy any F-35As? There are also reasons why the F-35A is a better plane than the F-35B in terms of its longer range. I think it could carry more stuff. Just the F-35B, because it's got this vertical takeoff capability and all this stuff, it's got extra stuff that makes it more expensive and more capable in some ways, but less capable in others. So for the sorts of things an Air Force does, you'd really rather have the F-35A. For the sorts of stuff the Navy does, and sure, an F-35B is the ticket. Of course, the U.S. Navy, because it has catapults, has something called the F-35C. That's a whole other thing. But ultimately, Italians end up with a larger F-35 fleet. Another thing that the Italians are doing with their ships is, I mentioned this already, but they're putting on more shipboard missile capabilities. They're also improving their deep strike capabilities. They've got Aster cells on deck. They're really interested in deep strike, anti-ship, and anti-air capabilities. Very, very important for modern naval warfare. This brings us to part 5, the Air Force. The Italians are building a sizable fleet of F-35As, and they're also modernizing its Eurofighter fleet. What they're doing is they're retiring older Tranche 1 jets and bringing in much more capable, newer versions of the Eurofighter, which will give Italy both a stealthy strike capability, thanks to the F-35s, and also an upgraded 4th generation air defense and air sort of superiority capability with the Eurofighter. So it's really pretty impressive, and I have to think that the RAF is going to look on the Italian Air Force with quite a bit of jealousy, which is something that I don't think the Brits ever want to admit, but I think it's probably the case. The DPP also talks about the importance of the country's bet on what's called the Global Combat Air Program, or GCAP. This is a program that the Italians are doing jointly with the UK and Japan. I did read recently that the Canadians are interested in it now. They're doing this both to keep Italian industry up to date and involved, but then also they want their Air Force to have the next generation of combat aviation. GCAP is supposed to be a 6th generation plane, whereas the F-35 is a 5th generation. So F-35's got all sorts of cool stealth and tech, but the 6th generation is supposed to take the tech to a whole other level, much more AI driven. Plus, they're supposed to have these, what do they call, like dedicated loyal wingmen, these unmanned loyal wingmen that are supposed to fly alongside and take care of some of the tasks that otherwise the plane wouldn't have to do, etc. So they exist within this whole complex ecosystem of different technologies. It's a very, very, very expensive project, but this is what the Italians are doing. I really should do a separate video, actually, come to think about it, about the GCAP, and I can also talk about the FCAS, which is the Franco-German project, which recently died. So in keeping with everything else, when the Italians are thinking Air Force, they're also thinking about deep strike and long-range fires, from standoff fires, from using their aircraft. So they are investing in more precision-guided munitions and cruise missiles to be carried by the aircraft and to be able to do deep strike stuff. You can hit deep targets while staying outside of dense air defense envelopes. Paired with the naval deep strike and the involving ground-based fires, the whole idea is that all 3 branches are going to have fairly impressive conventional long-range capabilities, which will help give them a conventional deterrent capability combined with a force projection capability. That's the idea. So you can see the same shift, whether you're looking at the air, the land, or the sea. You can see a shift towards, we're moving away from small stability operations towards being able to deter and to engage in and to survive peer or near peer. This brings us to part 6. Where is Italy headed? Taking together, the DPP portrays Italy as a state at the center of an arc of crisis, which is anchored in their vision of the wider Mediterranean, but attentive ostensibly to the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic. It frames the environment in terms of strategic rivalry, persistent instability, and renewed interstate warfare. Italy has stabilized its manpower, so the military is not shrinking, although it's not growing, but it's not shrinking. They've nudged the budgets upward, and they prioritize heavy and medium armor combined with strong amphibious capabilities, layered air defense air defense systems, naval deep strike systems, carrier-based and land-based F-35s, which also have deep strike capabilities, upgraded Eurofighters, and they're betting heavily on the future combat air thing that they're doing with the British and with the Japanese. Is Italy moving on the right track? I would say, yeah, they're certainly moving in the right direction. The problem is, and this is a classic thing, the problem that Italy faces is that because of the budget, because of the deficit, because of the debt, because of politics, the Italian government has really very limited room for maneuver. There might be some, and maybe even Meloni herself, Prime Minister Meloni, might want to do more, might want to spend more, but to some extent her hands are tied. She can't really do more than she's already doing. So arguably, given these realities, I would say they're moving closer, like they're doing a good job. Some things I really wonder about, though, like I really wonder, in light of Ukraine, how plausible it is for any of these militaries to field a, let's say, ground force, to be able to sustain the ground force, to be able to sustain attrition. Because ultimately, you're still talking about very small forces with very little in the way of depth. And this is something that worries me about the French and the Germans and the British as well. What can they actually really do that's useful? In theory, if you cobble together all these forces, this should turn out to be something where the whole should be greater than the sum of the parts. Maybe. And there also, if you're thinking about European militaries being cobbled together into some large chain, you also have the persistent problem that up until even now, none of these coalitions of ground forces can really operate without U.S. inputs, without America supplying certain kinds of enablers that the others don't bother with. The U.S. has always, it's always been, right, some of the teeth are going to be European, but ultimately a lot of the tail is going to be American. Gosh, if you want to like really push this metaphor even further, even if you think about your teeth, we have different kinds of teeth because we've got, like our sharp teeth in the front, and then we've got these molars in the back for grinding. You need all sorts of capabilities. So you need all sorts of enablers. America supplies that. And so the question also is whether or not the Italians, like the other militaries, are paying sufficient attention to that kind of stuff in order to fill in the gaps that it seems that maybe, just maybe, the Americans won't in fact provide, because it's really hard to say where these days the Americans are going. One thing I do think is positive about the Italian approach is that I think ultimately they have a sea power focused military, which I think is appropriate for them, rather than a land power focused. It just seems like if you just look at geography and you think about history, the idea of large Italian ground formations duking it out in Eastern Europe, I mean, it brings back some really bad memories from World War II. It just doesn't make that much sense. But the Italian fleet doing things and doing useful things, that makes sense. And so I applaud the fact that the Italian Navy seems to have pride of place in terms of Italian defense thinking. I think that's a very good thing. And when you look at the Italian Navy, honestly, it's really very impressive. Another question, though, that needs to be asked in light of Ukraine, in light of the Iran war, is whether or not the Italians, same question you can ask any of these militaries, are the Italians adequately taking on board the rise of drones and drone warfare? Yes, they have their drones and the MQ-9s and that kind of thing, but the MQ-9s are like, I don't know, it's like, it's too much. It's too much. They're too big. They're too expensive. What's defining the Ukraine war? Large numbers of relatively cheap drones that you can throw in swarms and keep throwing in swarms so that you can swamp air defenses. Can the Italians do this? No. Can they defend against it? Now, no. They're working on it. But even then, right, you can look at the air defenses. Are their air defenses really up to this? I think this is a huge question mark. Also, are the ground forces really learning how to operate in this new kind of environment? Like, think about the troubles that the Israelis apparently are having in southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah, surprise, surprise, is throwing a lot of drones at them, and it's doing really bad things. Because the Israelis actually, of all people, didn't take this threat seriously enough. So now they're like, oh, crap, we need to put nets on things, and nets on our bases, and nets everywhere, and nets on our vehicles. And they're adapting in that kind of way. Are the Italians doing that? And I don't know. I'm skeptical. But this skepticism applies not just to Italy, but frankly to all of the big militaries, including the U.S. military. I mean, I talk to people in the military, like my son's in the U.S. Army, and I talk to him, and he's like, yeah, we're totally doing it. We're totally doing this stuff, and we're practicing it. But enough. Like, are they taking it seriously enough? I know they're doing some, but are they really doing enough? Anyways, I hope you liked this video. If you look in the description, you're going to see links to my social media, plus my Substack, which is also called Pax Americana. You've got my website, michaelshirkin.com. And please stay tuned. There's a whole lot more in the pipeline. Thank you. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.